thanks for having me here today. I've turned on recording only for my introduction. After that, we're going to stop recording so we can all discuss freely. Today, we're talking about one of the chapters in the book called Lives of the Stoic. It's called Antipater the Ethicist. And Ryan Holiday, I think, took great care in naming the chapter with this because the ethical side of Stoicism is really what Antipater worked on during his lifetime. He was all about developing the morality of a Stoic and helping people achieve that through practical tips, much like we talk about modern Stoicism today, that there are many practical tips we can involve. And so that's really the theme of Antipater's life. I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along on the outline that I've created for today. First, I'm going to read a sample paragraph, and then I'll go briefly through the history of Antipater. The paragraph that I enjoy most from this chapter is this one. Previous Stoics had appeared at the Stoa and in theaters, but Antipater opted out. Instead, he invited friends over for dinner to have long discussions about philosophy. Athenaeus tells us in his book called The Learned Banqueters, written just after the time of Marcus Aurelius, that Antipater was a wonderful storyteller at these gatherings, illustrating his points with powerful anecdotes, while supporters urged him to challenge Carneades' oratory with bombast of his own. Antipater channeled his energy into the dinner table diplomacy as well as into written works, aimed not at triumph over his current rivals, but to help with the timeless trials of everyday life. So this is really, it shows what his goals were. And I'm going to give a few minutes of history here to give you a background, not just what was in the chapter by Ryan Holiday, but also some other research that I've done on Antipater, so you can place him in history with the other Stoics. The first item is we need to realize that his teacher was Diogenes of Babylon. This is the Diogenes that lived about the year 230 to 140 BC. This is not Diogenes the Cynic who lived in a barrel, the famous guy who lived in a barrel. So this Diogenes is another one. And this Diogenes was also the fifth leader of the Stoic school. Antipater, in turn, turns out to be the sixth leader of the school as his student. And we know even less of Antipater's life than compared to Diogenes of Babylon's life. We don't even know when Antipater was born exactly, but he lived through the year 130 BC, approximately. And he succeeded as leader of the school. He became leader about the year 142. So he had about 10 or 12 years there as leader of the Stoic school. And this is where he developed this idea of ethics that I mentioned earlier. This was in contrast to Diogenes, his teacher, who was very political, as mentioned in that paragraph. And this ethical side of Antipater is very important because it was noted by the historians and the biographers of that time, notably Plutarch and Cicero, who described Antipater in their works, and they called him more of a writer than an orator. In other words, he was very good at writing and expressing his ideas. To move to the works that we know about him is he had two books on divination, which was common to write about by the Stoics of those days. Divination back then meant basically talking about the benevolence of God. And Antipater also talked about some of those anecdotes that we just mentioned. Well, one of his favorite anecdotes was talking about the wife of Socrates, who is famous in history as being a very ill-tempered person. So this led to Antipater formulating the idea that we should choose our spouses very carefully. And of the fragments that are left of Antipater's works, he also talks about developing your morality as you deal with other people. That's why this chapter is called The Ethicist. And this example that I picked here for item number 4 is what Cicero had to say about Antipater. He said, if a wise man should inadvertently accept counterfeit money for good, will he offer it as genuine in payment of a debt after he discovers his mistake? Diogenes says yes. Antipater says no. And I agree with him. If a man knowingly offers for sale wine that is spoiling, ought he to tell his customers? Diogenes thinks that it is not required. Antipater holds that an honest man would do so. So this is a very specific story, and I like that at least this quote from Cicero has survived. Moving right along, number 5 is, I've mentioned before how Antipater talked about choosing your spouse carefully. Well, he actually developed this in his works. He talked about the need for successful marriages and for family life. And interestingly enough, the scholars agree that Antipater was one of the first ancient Stoics to talk about the need for successful marriages and family life. I think that it's interesting in history, we don't actually know if Antipater was married himself, but the French philosopher Michel Foucault describes Antipater's work and praises him as talking about marriage as the blending of two souls. And I think that this is a very good subtopic to discuss when we, as modern Stoics, discuss cosmopolis, because that's, of course, we getting along with society in general, and the family set or the family unit is really like a subset of that. So we should discuss this blending of two souls whenever we cover cosmopolis. Antipater also talked about common sense for Stoicism. This is a little bit more of a rare part of the ancient Stoic mindset, but it's interesting to know that the ancient Stoics had kind of an absolutist view of whether you were virtuous or vicious in nature. They thought that you were one or the other. And Antipater is one of the first ones to talk more about how we need to be more practical and we need to move in steps, learning our ethics and our morality and our dealings with other people. And so this is a lot about self-improvement. And Antipater was the one who added this practical nature in his place as a Stoic school leader. I think that's very important. It's what I would call a link to the modern Stoicism movement. Even way back then, he started us on the right path to be practical. Before I wrap up, I also need to cover the archery metaphor. This chapter does refer to the archery metaphor, but in my opinion, Ryan Holiday didn't state clearly if Antipater was the originator of it, but he actually was the originator of it. And in brief, this idea is that as an archer, you pull back the arrow and you use all your skill that you have to shoot the arrow as correctly as possible, but you're not going to delay and procrastinate and worry too much. You're still going to shoot that arrow, and if you miss the target, it's okay. You're going to try again as a Stoic to do this. I also found another article where John Sellers, the modern Stoicism scholar, states it very well. He says, the Stoic philosopher Antipater is reported to have drawn an analogy with archery when trying to explain the goal of Stoic ethics. The good Stoic, Antipater suggested, is like an archer. He does everything he can to hit the target, but his happiness does not depend on whether he hits the target or not. What matters is shooting well. For whether the arrow hits the target or not depends on other factors outside the archer's control. So that leads to the other dichotomy of control, another very good practical aspect of modern Stoicism. And to wrap up, I've talked about how Antipater contributed the practical aspect or side to Stoicism. And I want to bring that home by saying that today, in philosophy in general, we have many abstract discussions, most notably the trolley problem, where we think, if the train goes one way or another, one person is killed, a group of people are hurt or killed. Those types of things don't really happen in reality, but although they're notable thought experiments, they still don't happen in reality. And what I want to take a moment to to do here is to praise Antipater for bringing us practical examples, not just for the archer's problem, but for family and for the future of Cosmopolis. A lot of these ethical, practical sides, they have their origins going back to Zeno and Heraclitus, but Antipater was the one who brought them together. And I think that today we can even extend this further, not resting on our laurels, but we can go even further by thinking how we can deal with each other very well. I've recently reviewed the United Nations goals for 2030, the next 10 years. And the types of ethical and practical decisions we need to make are things like clean water, sustainable energy, equal education for people around the world. Those are other areas I think we can work on. So with that, I want to thank you for letting me speak. And now we're going to turn off the recording, and I'll stop sharing.